Everyone called my friend a coward for breaking his little brother's heart, but none of them knew the secret he was protecting. Opening with a slightly shaky, reflective tone, then building intensity, can you imagine having to betray your best friend? To break a solemn promise you made, knowing it could shatter his trust in you forever? Because I did. And it was the hardest, most terrifying choice of my life. But if I didn't, his little brother might never get to say goodbye. What the hell would you do? My friend Alan? Man, he was practically a legend. The kind of guy who lived for the rush, for proving he wasn't afraid of anything. I remember one time, he was only 15, and he'd made some crazy bet. He stood on the school roof, a wild grin on his face. I was screaming at him, telling him he was insane, that no bet was worth his life. But he just didn't listen. He crouched, shot himself off the edge, and landed feet first in the swimming pool below. We all thought he was a goner, the air just frozen in our lungs, until he burst through the surface, sputtering, and yelled, "Hand over the $50." The whole crowd erupted. He got suspended for a week, but he came back a hero. Everyone knew his name. Teachers would call him reckless, irresponsible. One even warned him he'd die young if he stayed so hard-headed. Alan would just shrug, flash that grin, and say, "Life's too short to be scared of anything." Oh, Alan. Those words, he'd end up eating them later. Junior year, he doubled down on the daredevil act. Spring break, there was this 40-foot cliff everyone talked about jumping off, but almost everyone would get to the edge, look down, and just chicken out. Not Alan. He just walked right up, took one look, and launched himself off like it was nothing. He disappeared deep into the water, and we stood there, mouths agape, screaming his name for what felt like 9 whole seconds. Then he popped up, laughing, yelling for us to jump in too. His Instagram exploded. Every week, new insane adventures. Skydiving, bungee jumping, cliff diving, racing his motorcycle on back roads that even cars struggled with. One time he broke his arm skateboarding down this ridiculously steep hill, and he literally just laughed it off while the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance. He even started a YouTube channel, doing increasingly crazy stunts. People loved him, especially his little brother, Andy. Andy watched every single video, probably 10 times over, trying to copy the skateboard tricks in their backyard, practicing parkour moves. He'd say, "I'm going to grow up brave like Alan." But then everything got weird. Last summer, on Andy's birthday, their parents took the whole family to Six Flags. Andy was thrilled, bragging about how he was finally tall enough for the big kid rides with his brave older brother. He was especially excited for this roller coaster called Thunder Mountain. It wasn't even that intense compared to the stuff Alan usually did. So, there they were, in line, waiting their turn, when Alan just stopped at the gate. His face had gone utterly pale. Literal sweat beaded on his forehead just from looking at the ride. "I'll wait here," Alan mumbled, gripping the gate so tight his knuckles turned white. Andy, bless his heart, thought he was joking at first. I mean, this was Alan, the guy who'd just jumped out of a plane a month before. Andy tugged on his arm, begging him to go. But Alan kept making excuses. "I feel sick. Ate too much funnel cake. This ride's for kids. It's boring for adults." Andy ended up riding alone, his excitement visibly deflating with every passing second. Alan just sat on a bench by the exit, people staring, wondering why an 18-year-old was too scared to go on a ride with his little brother. Andy came off that ride, his eyes glistening, trying not to cry. He didn't understand why Alan had abandoned him. And after that day, Alan became a different person entirely. He started driving to school 20 miles under the speed limit, people honking and yelling at him as they swerved to pass. He even bailed on our annual cliff jumping trip, something he'd organized for 3 years straight. When we asked him why, he just looked away, said he wasn't feeling it this year. But it wasn't just a slump. One of our friends found him selling all his sports equipment online that same week. The skydiving gear, the motorcycle, his whole skateboard collection, everything. His Instagram and YouTube went completely dark. No posts, no stories, nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. Andy, his little brother, stopped talking to him. When we'd bring Alan up, Andy's eyes would fill with tears, and he'd just call him a fake and a coward. It broke my heart, seeing them pass each other in the hallway at home, without a single word. Alan just stayed holed up in his room. Then, one day, I decided I had to check on him. I went over to his house, and I spotted him in his car, swallowing pills from an orange bottle. My stomach dropped. I walked over, tapped on his window. "Dude," I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "What's going on? Are you seriously turning to drugs now?" His eyes widened. He tried to make an excuse, stammering something about vitamins, but I wasn't buying it. Not until I saw the hospital bracelet under his passenger seat. His name, cardiology department, stamped right there. His hands shook as he finally explained. 3 weeks before Andy's birthday, he'd gone for a routine physical for a sports scholarship. The doctor heard something weird with his heart. They ran tests, and they found it. Something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Tears rolled down his cheeks then. He looked utterly broken. Any severe adrenaline spike, he choked out, could cause a heart attack. Do you know how heartbreaking it was to hear that I could drop dead from excitement? I was almost angry. Why didn't you tell any of us? Or, at least tell Andy. He shook his head, his voice cracking. I didn't want him to grow up afraid of chasing his own adventures. He paused, took a ragged breath. I'm going into surgery next month, and I think, for the first time, I'm terrified. The doctors had given him a 50-50 chance. That was last month. Today? Today is the day of his surgery, and it might be the last. Alan made me promise not to tell Andy about his heart condition. He begged me. But I'm sitting in my car outside the hospital at 6 o'clock in the morning, watching Alan's family arrive, and my hands won't stop shaking because I know what I'm about to do will destroy his trust in me. I can't watch Andy worship a ghost of his brother without understanding why Alan changed. Especially if today's surgery goes wrong and Andy never gets another chance to make things right. The hospital parking lot is almost empty this early. Just a few cars, an ambulance sitting idle. I watch Hank and Violet, Alan's parents, walk through the automatic doors. Violet clutching a small bag, Hank's arm around her shoulders like he's holding her up. They disappear inside, and I sit there for another minute, gripping my steering wheel so hard my knuckles turn white. My phone is already in my hand before I fully decide. I pull up Andy's contact, type out a message, deleting it twice before I get the words right. *, need to talk to you. Can you meet me at the coffee shop on Elm Street in 30 minutes? It's important. *, I hit send before I can chicken out. My phone buzzes almost immediately, but it's not Andy. It's Hank, asking if I'm coming to the hospital. I told them last night I'd be here. Early. I text back that I'll be there soon, which is technically true, but leaves out the part where I'm about to betray his son's biggest secret first. I start my car and drive the 2 blocks to Java Junction, this little place always open early for hospital workers. I order a black coffee I don't really want and sit at a table near the window where I can see Andy when he shows up. My leg won't stop bouncing under the table. The barista keeps looking at me like I'm suspicious, probably because I'm the only customer and I look like I'm about to rob the place, or maybe just throw up. 28 minutes later, Andy walks through the door, looking annoyed and confused. Probably expecting some stupid favor or drama about school. He orders an energy drink and sits across from me, arms crossed, still wearing that skateboard company hoodie Alan used to wear all the time. The hoodie has a rip in the left sleeve, a stain on the front. And seeing it, my chest hurts, because I remember when Alan bought it, back when he was still posting videos every week. Andy takes a long drink from his energy drink and stares at me. I can tell he's about to ask what this is about, probably getting ready to be mad that I dragged him out of bed this early. I don't give him the chance to speak first. Alan has a serious heart condition, I say, the words coming out flat and direct because there's no good way to say it. It's called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And he's in surgery right now, with 50-50 odds of surviving. Andy's face goes completely blank for 3 seconds. His energy drink is halfway to his mouth, frozen, like someone hit pause. Then he stands up so fast his chair falls backward with a crash that makes the barista jump. He calls me a liar, his voice cracking on the word. Because this can't be real. I pull out my phone and show him the photo I took of Alan's hospital bracelet and the cardiology department paperwork I spotted in his car that day. Andy snatches my phone and stares at the screen, reading the medical terms over and over. His eyes move across the words like if he reads them enough times, they'll say something different. I watch his anger shift into something that looks like drowning, like he's trying to breathe underwater and can't figure out which way is up. His hands are shaking when he finally looks up for my phone. He asks why nobody told him, his voice shaking with a hurt that cuts deeper than anger. And I explain that Alan didn't want him to be scared or to stop chasing his own adventures because of what happened to him. Andy throws my phone back at me. It skids across the table, nearly falling off the edge before I catch it. He says that's the stupidest thing he's ever heard. That he would have wanted to know. That he deserved to know his brother might die. His voice gets louder with each word, and the barista is definitely watching us now, but I don't care. I tell him the surgery started an hour ago. That his family is at Memorial Hospital right now, waiting. Andy's already running for the parking lot before I finish the sentence, and I chase after him because he's in no state to drive safely. He's fumbling with his car keys when I catch up. I grab his arm and tell him we're taking my car. He doesn't argue, just runs to my passenger side and yanks the door open. We take my car, and I break every speed limit getting to the hospital while Andy sits frozen in the passenger seat. He keeps whispering that he called Alan a coward and a fake, that those were the last real words they exchanged. And I can hear him trying not to cry, his breath coming in these short gasps, gripping the door handle so tight, I think he might rip it off. I run a red light, nearly hit another car making a left turn, and the driver honks and flips me off, but I just keep going. The hospital is only 2 miles away, but it feels like 20. I screech into the parking lot and don't even bother finding a proper spot. Just park in the fire lane near the entrance because we can deal with the ticket later. We burst into the surgical waiting room. Alan's parents look up in shock, clearly not expecting Andy to know anything yet. Violet starts crying immediately, and Hank's face goes hard with anger, asking how Andy found out. Andy just says he knows about the heart condition and demands to know if Alan's okay. His voice cracks on the last word. Violet stands up like she's going to hug him, but Hank holds up his hand, stopping her. Hank pulls me into the hallway, and his voice is low and mad. He says I had no right to break Alan's confidence, that I've made everything harder. His face is red, and there's this vein in his forehead pulsing, and he's standing close enough that I can smell the coffee on his breath. I stand my ground. I tell him Andy deserved to know before his brother possibly died. That keeping him in the dark was mean, even if the reason was to protect him. And that I'll deal with Alan being mad at me if it means Andy gets a chance to fix things. Hank's jaw clenches, and for a second I think he might actually hit me. His hands ball into fists at his sides. Then his shoulders drop, and he leans back against the wall like all the fight just drained out of him. His fists unclench, and he rubs his face with both hands, looking older than I've ever seen him. He tells me they were going to tell Andy after the surgery if things went well, that they were scared of adding more stress to an impossible situation. His voice cracks when he says Alan specifically didn't want Andy to see him as weak or broken. That keeping the brave older brother image mattered to Alan even more than being honest. I nod, because I get it now even though I still think they were wrong to wait this long. Hank puts his hand on my shoulder for a second and then walks back toward the waiting room without saying anything else. I follow him, and when we get back, I see Violet sitting with Andy on one of those uncomfortable hospital couches, holding his hand while he stares at the floor. She's explaining the condition in simple terms, using words like heart muscle and blood flow, and Andy keeps interrupting with questions. He asks about symptoms and when Alan first knew, and why he sold all his gear. Violet tells him about the Six Flags moment, when Alan realized he couldn't do anything that raised his heart rate too much, that the Thunder Mountain ride would have been dangerous for his heart. Andy makes this broken sound in his throat, like a sob he's trying to hold back, and says he thought Alan was abandoning him. Violet pulls him closer and explains that Alan was protecting himself, but also protecting Andy from having to worry. Andy asks if he can see Alan before surgery, and Violet's face goes soft with sadness. She tells him Alan's already under something called anesthesia and has been in the operating room for over an hour. The heart doctor estimated 4 to 6 hours total, which means we're stuck here all morning, not knowing if Alan's going to make it. I sit down in a chair across from them and check my phone because I don't know what else to do with my hands. The waiting room has that hospital smell, like cleaning products and fear, and there's a TV mounted in the corner playing some morning talk show with the volume too low to actually hear. About 20 minutes later, a nurse in blue scrubs comes through the double doors and calls out for the Larson family. We all stand up fast, and Violet grabs Hank's arm, wraps his arms around her while his own shoulders shake. Andy grabs my arm hard enough that it hurts, but I don't pull away because I'm pretty sure I'm the only thing keeping him standing right now. Aaron stands next to us with his hand on Andy's other shoulder, and I can see his eyes are wet, even though he's smiling. Dr. Lodge waits patiently while everyone processes the news, and then she continues explaining what happens next. She says Alan will be in the recovery room for about an hour while they monitor him coming out of anesthesia, and then he'll be moved to the ICU for at least 2 days. She warns us that he's going to be in a lot of pain and very tired, that the ICD implant site on his chest will be sore and swollen, and that he'll have strict activity limitations for weeks while everything heals. She emphasizes that this is major surgery and recovery won't be quick or easy, but the prognosis is good if Alan follows all the medical guidelines. Andy's hand is still gripping my arm when he asks the question everyone's been avoiding. He wants to know if Alan can ever do sports again, if he can skateboard or jump off cliffs or any of the stuff he used to do. Dr. Lodge's expression shifts to something more serious, and she kneels down slightly, so she's at eye level with Andy. She explains gently that Alan's extreme sports days are completely over, that even moderate exercise will need careful monitoring from now on. She says the ICD will shock Alan's heart if it detects a dangerously high heart rate, which means any activity that spikes his adrenaline could trigger the device. She adds that Alan can live a full life, but it will look very different from the one he had before. And I can tell from her tone that she's trying to prepare Andy for how much Alan's world has shrunk. Andy nods slowly and asks what Alan can do. Dr. Lodge lists off swimming, walking, light biking on flat ground. Basically, anything that keeps his heart rate in a moderate zone without sudden spikes. She says Alan will work with a cardiac rehab team to figure out safe exercise limits. But the days of throwing himself off buildings and racing motorcycles are gone forever. Hank asks about school and normal teenage activities, and Dr. Lodge reassures him that Alan can go back to school and hang out with friends and do most regular things. He just can't do anything that gets his heart racing. She stands back up and tells us she'll come get us when Alan's ready for visitors, probably in about an hour. And then she heads back through the surgical doors, leaving us all standing there, trying to absorb everything. The hour waiting to see Alan feels longer than the entire surgery did. We all sit back down, but nobody can stay still. I watch Andy bounce his leg up and down so fast it's making the whole row of chairs vibrate. He keeps turning to me and asking if Alan knows I told him about the heart condition, if anyone mentioned it to Alan before surgery. I admit I don't know, that I texted Hank this morning, but never got a response about whether they told Alan that Andy knows everything now. Andy chews on his thumbnail and says it doesn't matter anyway, because he's going to tell Alan himself that he's glad he knows, that he wishes he'd known from the beginning. Violet overhears and tells Andy that Alan specifically asked them not to say anything until after surgery, that he didn't want Andy to worry or feel responsible if something went wrong. Andy's face gets red, and he says that's exactly the problem, that Alan keeps trying to protect him from reality instead of trusting him to handle hard things. Hank starts to respond, but then stops himself, and I can see him realizing that Andy has a point. Aaron suggests that maybe this whole experience will help Alan understand that protecting people by lying to them usually causes more harm than being honest. And everyone nods, but nobody says anything else. The waiting room clock moves so slowly I start wondering if it's broken. And every time the surgical doors open, everyone's head snaps up, hoping it's someone coming to get us. Finally, after what feels like 3 hours, but is probably only 50 minutes, Coral pushes through the doors and walks over to our group. Coral says, "We can see Alan now, but only 2 people at a time for just 5 minutes, because he needs rest and quiet." Hank and Violet stand up immediately, and Coral leads them through the doors toward the ICU, leaving Andy and me and Aaron sitting in the waiting room. Andy starts that pacing thing again, counting his steps and touching the wall, and I can tell he's using it to keep himself from completely losing it. Aaron asks if Andy wants to talk about what he's feeling, but Andy shakes his head and says he just needs to see his brother alive and awake. We wait for what feels like forever, but is probably only 10 minutes. And then Hank and Violet come back through the doors. Violet is crying again, but this time she's smiling at the same time, and she tells Andy that Alan's awake and asking for water and complaining about all the tubes. She laughs and says it sounds exactly like Alan trying to act tough even when he's clearly not okay. And Andy's whole face relaxes, hearing that his brother is alert enough to be annoying. Coral appears behind them and says, "Andy and my name can go now," and she reminds us again that we only have 5 minutes and we need to be quiet and calm. Andy doesn't wait for her to finish talking before he's already walking toward the ICU doors. And I follow him through a hallway with bright lights and the smell of cleaning supplies and beeping machines everywhere. Andy and I walk into the ICU room, and Alan looks terrible. His skin is so pale it's almost gray, and there's sweat on his forehead even though the room is cold. Tubes run from his arms and chest to different machines that beep and hum, and there's a huge white bandage covering the left side of his chest where they implanted the ICD. His eyes are half closed, but they focus when he hears us come in. First on Andy, and then on me. I watch his face change as he registers that Andy is here, that Andy knows everything, and I see this complicated mix of emotions cross his features. There's relief that he doesn't have to keep hiding anymore, but also anger that I broke my promise. And underneath it all, there's fear about how Andy is going to react. Alan's hand moves slightly like he wants to reach out, but the 4 lines stop him, and his mouth opens like he's going to say something, but no sound comes out at first. Andy walks straight to the bed without hesitating, and he stands there looking down at his brother with tears running down his face. He says he's sorry for calling Alan a coward, that he understands now why everything changed, and that he wishes Alan had trusted him enough to tell him the truth from the beginning. His voice cracks on the last part, and he has to stop and breathe before continuing. Alan's voice comes out raspy and rough from the breathing tube they had down his throat during surgery. He manages to say he was trying to protect Andy, that he didn't want Andy to grow up scared or to stop chasing adventures because of what happened to him. Andy shakes his head hard and says that was stupid. That brothers are supposed to protect each other by being honest, not by lying and shutting each other out. He says he would rather have known and been scared than spent months thinking his brother hated him or had become someone he didn't recognize. Alan's eyes fill with tears, and one runs down the side of his face onto the pillow, and Andy reaches out carefully and takes Alan's hand, avoiding all the tubes and wires connecting him to the machines. Alan's eyes lock onto mine, and I see the question there without him saying anything. This look that asks why I told Andy when he specifically asked me not to. I meet his stare, and my voice comes out steadier than I expected when I say, "I'm sorry for breaking your trust. But I'm not sorry Andy knows." I tell him Andy deserved the chance to be here today, to understand what really happened instead of thinking his brother turned into someone else for no reason. I say I'd make the same choice again, even knowing it might cost me his friendship, because some things matter more than keeping promises. Alan stares at me for what feels like forever, and his face does this complicated thing, where he's processing what I said. The machines keep beeping, and Andy's still standing there holding his brother's hand, not saying anything, but watching both of us. Alan's mouth opens like he's going to argue, or yell at me. But then he just closes it again, and his whole body sags back into the pillows. His voice comes out rough and tired when he finally speaks, saying he's too exhausted to be mad right now, that we can fight about it later if he survives recovery. The way he says "if" makes my chest tight because it's so honest, no pretending he's definitely going to be fine. Andy makes this sound that's half laugh and half sob. This broken noise that comes from somewhere deep in his throat. He squeezes Alan's hand tighter, being super careful to avoid all the 4 lines running into his brother's arms. Alan's eyes are already starting to close, his eyelids drooping like he can't keep them open anymore, even though he's trying. the exhaustion from surgery, and all the emotions is pulling him under, and Andy just stands there holding his hand while Alan's breathing gets slower and more even. Coral steps into the room, and her voice is gentle but firm when she tells us time's up, that Alan needs to rest now. She explains he'll be more alert tomorrow, and we can have longer visits then, but right now his body needs to focus on healing. Andy's face crumples, and he doesn't want to let go of Alan's hand, his fingers gripping tighter, like if he holds on Alan will be okay. Violet moves to Andy's side and puts her hand on his shoulder, gently pulling him back from the bed. Andy resists for a second, but then lets go, his hand sliding away from Alan slowly. As we're walking toward the door, Alan mumbles something that's barely audible over the machine sounds. It sounds like, "Thank you." But his words are slurred with exhaustion, and I'm not sure if he's talking to the nurses or to me or to Andy, or maybe all of us. We file out into the hallway, and the ICU door closes behind us with this soft click that feels so final. Back in the waiting room, everything Andy's been holding in just breaks. His face twists up, and he starts crying for real. Not the quiet tears from before, but full-body sobs that shake his shoulders. Hank moves fast and pulls Andy into his arms, holding him tight while Andy cries into his dad's chest. All the fear and anger and relief from the past few months comes pouring out in these huge gasping sobs. Hank doesn't say anything, just holds his son, and lets him fall apart. Aaron sits down next to them, and he doesn't try to make it better with words or tell Andy everything will be fine. He just sits there being present, letting Andy cry it out without trying to fix it. Violet sits on Andy's other side and rubs his back in small circles. I stand there watching, feeling like I should give them space, but also not wanting to leave. The waiting room has a few other families scattered around, and they're pretending not to notice, but I can see them glancing over. Andy cries for probably 5 minutes straight. These deep, painful sobs that sound like they're being ripped out of him. Eventually, the crying slows down to hiccups and shaky breaths, and Hank just keeps holding him. I need air and space to think, so I step outside the hospital's main entrance. The evening sun hits my face, and I finally pull out my phone, which I've been ignoring for hours. The screen lights up with notification after notification. 27 messages from different friends asking about Alan. Texts from Kellen, from other kids at school wanting to know if the rumors are true, from people I barely talk to suddenly acting concerned. I stare at all the messages and realize I need to say something before the gossip gets completely out of control. I open a group text with most of our friend group and type out a message saying, "Alan had heart surgery. It went well, and he needs privacy right now." I hit send, knowing this will probably create more questions than it answers, but at least it stops people from making up stories. My phone starts buzzing immediately with responses, but I silence it and shove it back in my pocket. The cool air feels good after being in the hospital all day, and I take a few deep breaths before heading back inside. When I walk back into the waiting room, Violet catches my eye and gestures for me to follow her to a quieter corner. We move away from where Hank and Aaron are still sitting with Andy, and Violet's eyes are red from crying, but her voice is steady. She tells me she wants to apologize for Hank's anger earlier, that they were both scared and overwhelmed, and taking it out on me wasn't fair. I start to say it's okay, but she holds up her hand and keeps talking. She says, "You did the right thing telling Andy, even though it went against Alan's wishes. That keeping Andy in the dark was hurting him in ways they didn't fully understand until today." Violet admits she was actually planning to tell Andy herself today if the surgery went well. "But you saved Andy from spending the whole surgery not knowing his brother might die." Her voice cracks on the last part, and she reaches out and squeezes my arm. I tell her I was terrified Alan would hate me for it, but I couldn't watch Andy suffer anymore without knowing why. She nods and says Alan will understand eventually, that right now he's too tired and overwhelmed, but once he's thinking clearly, he'll see I gave him and Andy a chance to fix things. Nobody wants to go home, even though visiting hours are technically limited to short periods. We all end up camping out in the waiting room. This weird vigil where we're just existing in the same space because leaving feels wrong. Aaron makes another coffee run and comes back with cups for everyone. The good stuff from the coffee shop down the street instead of the terrible hospital vending machine coffee. He sits down next to Andy and starts teaching him some breathing exercises for managing worry and stress. Andy actually pays attention instead of brushing it off like he usually does with adult advice, following along as Aaron demonstrates breathing in for 4 counts and out for 6. They practice together, and I can see Andy's shoulders gradually relaxing, his breathing becoming less ragged. Hank and Violet sit close together on the other side of the waiting room, talking in low voices and occasionally glancing over at Andy. The hours pass slowly, marked by Coral coming out periodically to update us that Alan's stable, that his vitals look good, that he's sleeping peacefully. Around 7 o'clock, Coral comes out one more time and tells us Alan's vitals are holding steady, and he's sleeping comfortably. She says we should all go home and rest because tomorrow will be a long day of recovery monitoring, and Alan will need us alert and ready. Hank and Violet exchange a look and decide they're staying overnight in the family room the hospital provides for parents of ICU patients. But they both turn to Andy and insist he needs to go home and sleep in his own bed. That staying here all night won't help anyone. Andy looks like he wants to argue, but he's exhausted, his eyes red and puffy from crying, his whole body sagging with tiredness. He asks if I can stay over at their house because he doesn't want to be alone tonight. Hank nods immediately and says, "That's a good idea." And Violet hugs Andy tight before we leave. The drive to their house is quiet. Both of us too drained to talk much. At Andy's house, we stand in the kitchen trying to figure out what to eat and eventually just order pizza because neither of us has the energy to cook. We take the pizza into the living room and turn on the TV, but neither of us really watches it, just staring at the screen while our minds are somewhere else. Andy picks at his slice and then sets it down, turning to look at me. He asks what exactly Alan said that day in the car about being scared, like he needs to hear the specific words. I tell him Alan cried talking about how crushing it was to learn he could drop dead from getting too excited, that his whole identity was built on being fearless, and suddenly fear was the thing keeping him alive. I explain how Alan said he didn't want Andy to grow up afraid of chasing adventures, that protecting Andy from that fear seemed more important than being honest. Andy listens without interrupting, his eyes fixed on my face like he's memorizing every detail. Andy's quiet for a minute, and then admits something that clearly costs him to say out loud. He tells me he's been trying dangerous skateboard tricks and parkour moves, specifically because he was angry at Alan for becoming boring and safe. He says it was like he was trying to prove he was braver than his brother, that he could do the things Alan stopped doing. His voice gets thick, and he says he wanted to show Alan up, to make him feel bad for quitting. I look at him and tell him that's exactly why Alan didn't want him to know about the heart condition, because Alan was terrified of 2 possible outcomes. Either Andy would stop chasing adventures completely out of fear, or Andy would push himself even harder trying to compensate for what Alan lost. Andy's eyes widen slightly, and he says, "That's actually pretty smart psychology for someone who acts like feelings don't exist most of the time." We both almost laugh at that, this moment of lightness in a really heavy day. Andy pulls his knees up to his chest and wraps his arms around them, and we sit there in the quiet living room with the TV flickering. Both of us processing everything that happened today and everything that's still to come. We sit there for another hour just talking, and somehow the conversation shifts to what being brave actually means now that we've watched Alan go through all this. Andy pulls his knees tighter to his chest and says, watching Alan walk into that operating room knowing he might not wake up was the bravest thing he's ever seen anyone do. I nod and tell him that breaking my promise to Alan and telling Andy the truth was probably the hardest choice I've ever made. That I kept second-guessing myself the whole drive to the coffee shop. Andy looks at me and says he's glad I did it even though it was technically a betrayal. That some betrayals are actually loyalty to something more important than a promise. We finally head to bed around midnight, both exhausted, but feeling like we said everything that needed saying. The next morning, I wake up to Andy already dressed and pacing by the front door at 7 o'clock, asking if we can leave for the hospital right now. We grab breakfast sandwiches from a drive-thru and eat them in the car on the way over, neither of us really tasting the food because we're too anxious to see if Alan's actually doing better. When we get to the ICU, Violet meets us in the hallway, and her whole face lights up, telling us Alan's awake and alert and asking for real food instead of ice chips. We walk into his room, and Alan's sitting up slightly against a pile of pillows, still pale, but his eyes are focused instead of that drugged-out look from yesterday. Andy walks right up to the bed and launches into the story about the skateboard tricks he's been trying lately. And I watch Alan's eyes go wide with alarm until Andy starts laughing and says he's totally joking, that he's done trying to be Alan version 2, and he's going to figure out his own thing instead. Alan's shoulders relax, and he reaches out to punch Andy's arm weakly, telling him he's an idiot for scaring him like that. Then Alan's face gets serious, and he looks at Andy and says he's sorry for lying about why everything changed, that he should have trusted Andy to handle the truth instead of assuming Andy couldn't deal with it. Andy sits on the edge of the bed, carefully avoiding all the wires and tubes, and he says they're both idiots who need to work on communication. Alan actually laughs at that, and then immediately winces, grabbing his chest and making this pain sound. Andy jumps up, looking panicked, but Alan waves him off, saying, "Laughing just hurts like hell right now." I step closer to the bed and apologize again for breaking my promise, telling Alan I know he asked me not to tell Andy, but I couldn't let him go into surgery with things broken between them. Alan stares at me for a minute and then says he had a lot of time to think while lying in the ICU last night, hooked up to all these machines. He admits he was angry at first when his parents told him I'd told Andy, but then he realized I gave him and Andy a chance to fix things before surgery instead of after, which would have been too late if something had gone wrong during the procedure. He says he's not ready to say we're completely okay yet, but he understands why I did it, which honestly is more than I expected from him. Dr. Lodge comes in right then for morning rounds, checking Alan's monitors and asking him questions about his pain levels and whether he's having any chest discomfort beyond the surgical site. She pulls up a chair and explains Alan's recovery plan in detail, saying he'll need 6 weeks of absolutely no physical activity beyond walking, then 3 months of supervised cardiac rehab, where they'll slowly build up his exercise tolerance. She lists out the lifetime activity restrictions, explaining that his heart can't handle the stress of extreme sports anymore. Alan interrupts and asks directly if he can ever skateboard or cliff jump again. His voice tight, like he already knows the answer, but needs to hear it said out loud. Dr. Lodge looks him right in the eyes and says absolutely not. That those activities could trigger his ICD to shock him, or even worse, cause sudden cardiac death despite having the device implanted. The room goes completely silent for a few seconds while Alan processes that, his jaw working like he's trying not to cry. Andy breaks the silence by asking what Alan can do, and Dr. Lodge's expression softens as she lists out swimming, walking, light biking on flat terrain. Basically, anything that keeps his heart rate in a moderate zone without sudden spikes. Alan looks devastated hearing his new limitations spelled out so clearly, staring down at his hands instead of making eye contact with anyone. Andy immediately starts brainstorming things they can do together that aren't extreme sports, talking about fishing or photography, or teaching Andy to drive when he gets his permit next year. Alan glances up at Andy and manages a small smile, nodding along, even though you can tell he's still processing the loss of everything he used to be. Over the next 2 days, Alan stays in the ICU while the doctors monitor his heart rhythm and adjust his medications to find the right combination. Andy and I visit every day after school, bringing homework to do in the waiting room and spending every allowed minute in Alan's room. Slowly, Alan starts joking around again, making fun of the hospital food that tastes like cardboard and complaining about the constant monitoring that wakes him up every time he starts to fall asleep. It feels like the real Alan coming back, even though he's different now, quieter and more careful, but still himself underneath all the changes. On the second day, Kellen texts asking if he and 2 other friends can visit, and Alan agrees, but makes me promise to keep it short because he gets tired really fast. They show up looking uncomfortable and out of place in the ICU, not knowing what to say or where to look with all the medical equipment everywhere. They ask the usual awkward questions about when he's coming back to school and when he can hang out again, and Alan tells them he'll be back eventually, but he's not the same person they knew before. The room gets tense and uncomfortable until Andy breaks it by roasting Kellen's new haircut, saying it looks like he lost a fight with a lawnmower. Everyone laughs, including Alan, who winces again but keeps smiling. and the friends leave shortly after, looking relieved to escape the hospital atmosphere. On day 3, a nurse comes in and announces Alan's being moved from ICU to a regular room, which feels like a huge milestone, even though he's still got a long recovery ahead. The cardiac monitor comes with him, but he has way fewer tubes and wires, and he can actually get up to use the bathroom with someone helping him instead of being stuck in bed. Violet cries happy tears watching him walk 10 steps across the room without collapsing, holding on to a nurse's arm, but moving on his own power. Aaron shows up that afternoon carrying a folder full of paperwork, and he sits with Alan explaining the homebound instruction plan for the first 2 weeks after discharge. He's already coordinated with all of Alan's teachers to get assignments sent home. And he's arranged for Alan to have elevator access and permission to leave class whenever he feels unwell once he's back at school. Alan looks genuinely grateful for the practical help, saying he was worried about falling behind and having to repeat senior year. Alan shifted in his hospital bed and looked at Aaron with this expression like he was building up to something difficult. He asked if everyone at school knew about his heart condition by now, and Aaron leaned back in his chair, admitting that word had definitely spread around, but he'd been shutting down the worst rumors and protecting Alan's privacy as much as possible. Alan stared at the ceiling for a minute, just thinking, and then he said, "Maybe it was time to tell people the truth myself instead of letting rumors fill in the blanks." He pointed out that hiding everything created the whole mess with Andy in the first place, and maybe being honest from the start would have been easier than trying to control information and failing. Anyway, Aaron nodded and said that was a mature way to look at it. That owning your story is usually better than having others tell it for you. That evening, after Aaron left and visiting hours ended, Alan pulled out his phone and opened the camera app. He propped it against the water pitcher on his bedside table and hit record, then started explaining in this quiet but steady voice that he had something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. He told the camera about the surgery to implant an ICD device in his chest, about how the doctors had to reduce some of the thickened heart muscle, and about how his extreme sports days were completely over now. His voice cracked a little when he said that last part, but he kept going, explaining that any major adrenaline spike could trigger dangerous heart rhythms, or even sudden cardiac death despite the device. When he finished recording, he watched it back twice, made a few adjustments, then saved it as a draft instead of posting. He told the night nurse he wanted to be home and stronger before he dealt with whatever reaction the internet would throw at him. 5 days after surgery, a different doctor came in during morning rounds and announced Alan was discharged. Violet cried happy tears while a nurse went over a massive list of medications and restrictions, handing them printed instructions that looked like a small book. The ride home took twice as long as normal because Hank drove like he was transporting explosives, going 20 under the speed limit, and taking every turn like it might shatter Alan into pieces. Every bump in the road made Alan wince and grab his chest, and Andy sat in the back arranging and rearranging pillows to cushion Alan from the seat belt pressure. They made it home without any major problems, though Alan looked exhausted just from sitting upright in a car for 15 minutes. Inside the house, Alan slowly made his way upstairs with Hank supporting one arm and had to stop twice to catch his breath. When he finally got to his room, he stopped in the doorway and just stared because everything had been completely rearranged. His bed was positioned closer to the door so he wouldn't have to walk as far. His dresser had been moved within arm's reach, and someone had set up a small table next to the bed with all his medications organized in a daily pill organizer. Violet had printed out a detailed schedule for medications and wound care that was taped to the wall where he could see it from bed with different colored highlighters marking morning, afternoon, and evening doses. Alan looked around at all the preparations and made a joke about being treated like he was 80 years old, but you could see in his face that he was actually grateful for all of it, even if he wouldn't say it directly. Andy had even moved a mini fridge into the corner, stocked with water bottles and the protein shakes the hospital nutritionist recommended. The first week home turned out to be way harder than anyone expected. Alan got exhausted just from walking to the bathroom and back, and he'd collapse on his bed, breathing heavy like he'd just run a marathon. He got frustrated with how weak he felt, snapping at people over small things and apologizing minutes later when he realized he was being unfair. His chest hurt constantly from the incision, and the ICD implant site stayed sore, and swollen despite the ice packs Violet kept rotating. Andy set up a gaming station in Alan's room on the third day, dragging in his PlayStation and an extra controller so they could play together without Alan having to go downstairs. I came over after school most days to hang out, and we'd play games or watch videos or just talk about normal stuff that had nothing to do with hearts or hospitals. Slowly, Alan started having more good hours than bad ones, staying awake longer, and complaining less about the pain. About 6 days after coming home, Alan decided it was time to post the video he'd recorded in the hospital. He uploaded it to his Instagram and YouTube with a simple caption saying he owed everyone an explanation for why he disappeared. Within an hour, the video had racked up thousands of views, and the comments kept flooding in faster than anyone could read them. Most people were supportive, leaving messages about how glad they were that he was alive and sending recovery wishes with heart emojis. But there were definitely some jerks in the comments, saying he was stupid for doing extreme sports in the first place, that he deserved what happened for being so reckless, and that natural selection was just doing its job. Alan's jaw went tight with anger reading those comments, and his hands shook a little as he scrolled through the worst ones. Andy grabbed Alan's phone and started reading through the comments himself, blocking the worst trolls and reporting the really nasty ones for harassment. Then he opened his own phone and started recording a response video right there in Alan's room, talking directly to the camera about how his brother was the bravest person he knew for facing surgery and being honest about his limitations. The video came out kind of awkward because Andy wasn't used to being on camera, stumbling over words, and looking away from the lens when he got emotional. But it was genuine and real in a way that polished videos never are. And when he posted it, people responded to that authenticity. Alan watched the video 3 times with this expression on his face like he couldn't quite believe his little brother was defending him publicly after months of calling him coward. He didn't say anything, but he reached over and squeezed Andy's shoulder, and Andy squeezed back. 2 weeks after surgery, Alan had his first follow-up appointment with Dr. Lodge at her office instead of the hospital. She examined his chest incision, which was healing cleanly without any signs of infection, then pulled up his ICD data on her computer to review his heart rhythm patterns. She smiled and said his recovery progress was excellent, that the ICD was functioning perfectly, and his heart rhythm had been stable the entire 2 weeks. She explained this meant he could start cardiac rehab next week, which would involve carefully monitored exercise to gradually rebuild his strength and stamina within safe limits. Alan asked what safe limits actually meant, and she said they'd keep his heart rate below 140 beats per minute during rehab, slowly increasing activity intensity over several months while watching how his heart responded. Around the same time as the doctor visit, Aaron called saying he'd been working with the school administration to arrange Alan's return. He'd set up a plan for Alan to come back part-time, starting with half days for the first 2 weeks and building up to full days over the month. The PE teacher had reached out specifically asking to meet with Alan privately before he came back to class. So Aaron scheduled that meeting for the day before Alan's first day back. When Alan showed up to the PE teacher's office, the teacher explained that Alan would be helping in class instead of participating, maybe learning about sports medicine and exercise physiology from a different angle. He'd already ordered some textbooks about cardiac health and athletes and sports injury prevention that Alan could study, and he suggested Alan might even consider that field for college, since he had personal experience now. Alan admitted that actually sounded interesting, even though it meant watching others do what he couldn't anymore, that maybe there was a way to stay connected to athletics without putting himself at risk. Alan's first day back at school turned out to be incredibly weird. Everyone stared as he walked through the hallways, moving slower than he used to, and people kept stopping him to ask questions about the surgery or tell him they'd watched his video. Some kids treated him like he was made of glass, offering to carry his backpack or asking if he needed to sit down every 5 minutes. By lunch, Alan was completely exhausted and frustrated, dropping into a chair at our usual table and putting his head in his hands. He said he hated being the sick kid instead of the legend everyone used to know, that he didn't recognize this version of himself that couldn't even make it through a half day of school without needing a nap. I reminded him he was still a legend, just for surviving and coming back. That most people would have hidden at home for months, but he was facing it head on. Andy joined us and said he'd heard 3 different versions of what happened in surgery, including one where Alan technically died on the table and got brought back, which was completely made up, but showed how much people were talking about him. Alan managed a tired smile and said at least people were talking about him for something real this time, instead of just another stupid stunt. The next day at lunch, Andy dropped his tray next to Alan's and announced he was trying out for the swim team. Alan looked up from his sandwich, confused, because Andy had been all about skateboarding since he was 9. Andy explained he wanted a sport they could eventually do together, something that wouldn't make Alan sit on the sidelines watching. Alan sat there quiet for a second, then his face did this thing where you could tell he was trying not to get emotional. They started planning training sessions for when Alan got cleared for swimming, talking about lap times and breathing techniques. And it was the first time I'd seen Alan look excited about the future instead of just scared of it. Andy pulled up YouTube videos of Olympic swimmers on his phone, and they watched together. Alan pointing out form details like he was already coaching. 3 weeks passed, and Alan came home from his first cardiac rehab session practically bouncing with energy. He found me and Andy in the driveway shooting hoops and started talking fast about the treadmill they had him on, how it was hooked up to monitors tracking every heartbeat. He'd walked for 20 minutes at a moderate pace without any problems, no chest pain or irregular rhythms, and the physical therapist said his numbers looked great. Alan admitted it wasn't cliff jumping or motorcycle racing, but moving his body again without terror felt incredible. He demonstrated the walking pace right there in the driveway, arms swinging, and Andy timed him on his phone, saying they'd beat that time next session. 2 days later, Alan got an email from some youth health organization asking if he'd speak at a high school assembly about heart conditions in young athletes. He showed me the email looking nervous, saying he'd never done public speaking and didn't know if he could talk about the scary parts without breaking down. I told him we'd practice until he felt ready, and we spent the next week working on talking points. Alan wrote out everything about recognizing symptoms, the importance of getting checked if something felt wrong, how he'd ignored early warning signs during workouts. We sat in his room, and he practiced on Andy and me, stumbling over words at first, but getting smoother each time. Andy gave feedback about which parts landed best and which parts needed more detail. 6 weeks after surgery, the assembly happened. Alan stood on the auditorium stage in front of 200 students with Dr. Lodge next to him for medical backup. He told his whole story, including the part about being scared for the first time ever and having to figure out what bravery meant when you couldn't do the things that used to define you. When he finished talking, the auditorium went completely silent for like 5 seconds before everyone started clapping. I spotted Andy in the front row looking proud, clapping so hard his hands had to hurt. After the assembly ended, 3 students came up to Alan privately and admitted they'd been having chest pain during sports practice, but were too afraid to tell anyone. Watching them pull out their phones to schedule appointments with Dr. Lodge right there made something click in Alan's face. His story might actually save lives, which was a completely different kind of legacy than Instagram stunts, but maybe more important. It makes you think, doesn't it? What true bravery really looks like, or what it means to be honest, even when it's hard. Have you ever had to make a choice that felt like a betrayal, but deep down, you knew it was the right thing to do? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts.